Welcome to Digital Pride Community Conversations, part of the Louisville Pride Foundation's response to COVID-19. Last week, we talked about racial disparities in COVID-19 and making and donating PPE. And Thursday, we're going to talk about mutual aid and community response. And next Tuesday, we're going to talk about immigrants and refugees and how COVID-19 is affecting them. But today we're talking with Judge Angela Bisig about what's going on in the court system and the justice system with the courts being closed. Judge Bisig has been a member of the Kentucky Judiciary for 18 years, and she's currently the Chief Circuit Court Judge. She was elected to the Circuit Court in November of 2012. And prior to that, she was elected and served for 10 years as a Jefferson County District Judge. So she's got a lot of experience, and we're very lucky to have her with us today. Digital Pride, we also have a drag show that happens online Fridays at 8 p.m. brought to you by United Auto Workers Local 862. And we are coordinating a conference call task force group of LGBT groups and social service providers with the Fairness Campaign. And those are happening Mondays at 4 p.m. And we're going to start broadcasting those on Facebook Live just to keep people updated with information and so they can see what's going on, what the needs in the community are. We want to thank our sponsors, United Auto Workers, Local 862, Connolly Law Offices, Norton Healthcare, Fairness Campaign, and Evo Mortgage. And I think there we are. Judge Bisig, thank you for joining me today. How are you? I guess you're going into work. You're not working from home.
Thank you, Mr. Slayton. Yeah, so you're with me in, for judges, we call this our chambers. It's what you call a judicial office. So you and your viewers are with me back in my judicial chambers. We are conducting most of the hearings that we have virtually. So we're using Skype or Zoom or teleconferencing. So I'm coming into work every day, but I can tell you I see far fewer people than I would on a normal work day. We have taken a lot of different steps here in the court system to reduce anybody needing to come here. This building, the Hall of Justice and the Judicial Center, between the two of them are two of the, I think I have heard it is the most trafficked building in the Commonwealth when we're up and running full bore. So right now it's a little eerie down here because it's pretty quiet, but we're trying to keep the wheels of justice turning even during this pandemic. So yeah, I'm down at work most days, but it looks a lot different than it used to.
Well, what's the situation overall? Are the courts, they're mostly closed, but obviously some things are still going on. So can you just kind of give us a quick update on where we are?
Yeah, for your listeners who just wonder what's going on in the courthouse, you know, are laws still being enforced, or cases still being heard, I can tell them that from a Supreme Court order, so statewide, the courts are on officially what we call a slowdown. So we're not closed, but we are functioning on a somewhat reduced basis. The longer this goes on, the more we're trying to open things up. But I do want to let your viewers know at the outset that domestic violence cases and cases involving children, you can still contact a family court judge if you need help with visitation. Now you have to be patient. It's not in the same way it was before, but domestic violence victims can still come down to the courthouse 24 hours a day to the Domestic Violence Intake Center, and then emergency protective order hearings are still being held here at the courthouse. And I think it's important to get that out at the front. So we deal in criminal and civil cases. Of course, criminal cases are where people violate our laws. So we had to immediately jump into gear in terms of being able to Skype and teleconference with individuals who are in jail. We are still holding those hearings. It's on a somewhat limited basis because of our access to people who are over in jail, but both our district court judges are still arraigning people on new charges, and our circuit court judges daily, as well as holding hearings. We just have a more limited frame of time that we can actually get lawyers on a conference call like you and I are today, Mr. Slayton, or have them, sometimes lawyers are coming in, but they're observing social distance in the courtroom. So we're still handling, but on a more limited basis, criminal cases. Civil cases, the first couple of weeks were pretty much on hold. Civil cases are where one citizen's suing the other citizen over money. We're taking those off hold and hearing things on a more emergency basis, again, using technology to do that. So the court system is running, and then of course we can write orders and review briefs and do things like we would normally do. The court system is running, it's just running on a little more of a limited basis. Our clerks are down here processing cases. They're on double shifts. Our sheriffs are down here, but everybody's, again, limited in where they're going in the building and who they have access to. So it's good the community know the wheels of justice are here. They're just running differently and probably a little more slowly than the community's used to.
I know that, you know, the actual way the courts work, even in a normal situation, is not like what we see on TV or movies or things like that, that, you know, the dramatic courtroom scenes with the jury are few and far between. But I guess jury trials are they able to happen right now, or is that on hold?
So, you know, you're right. There probably aren't as many jury trials as there were. I don't even know what the time frame would be, but we still try a good number of cases in Jefferson County. I know in my division, we've had, you know, we can have as many as 17 trials in a year, which is a couple a month, can be a couple a month. And right now, because of the difficulty, when we bring in a group of jurors from the community, of course, they're called in from voter registration, your driver's license. We bring in 300 to 400 people in a jury pool room, which is here in the Judicial Center, and they receive an orientation. They get a welcome to the justice system. They learn a little bit about the kinds of trials we hold and what they might be asked to sit on. And so there's a point where we have all of those jurors piled into one room, which is a pretty large community event. Then they break out for different voir dire panels. Those are question and answer sessions that they go into any given courtroom. And even then, I may have 45 to 50 people in my courtroom in pretty close quarters as they sit back in the benches of my courtroom. So for right now, we've suspended all of that, as you can imagine, because of the difficulty in allowing any kind of social distancing or other CDC recommended practices right now. The goal is right now that the justice system is going to be hopefully up and running more as normal starting June 1. The Supreme Court has extended our slowdown period through the end of May. So we've got a little ways to go. We'll have to send the call outs to the citizens that are going to be serving on those juries starting in June, obviously starting in May, just the mail notice. And then we'll have to think through what we can do in terms of trying to make it a little less up close and personal when you come for a jury service. And once we start doing the call out for the new set of jurors, I'm sure we'll start addressing those issues. So you're right, right now there are no jury trials going on in Jefferson County, and there won't be until at least sometime in June.
And is the grand jury meeting?
The grand jury, we had a grand jury in place when the slowdown first went into effect, and we tried to finish up the cases we had to present to the grand jury. But no, we have not impaneled a new grand jury for the same reason. It's hard to bring a number of people down. I know a lot of people probably aren't very familiar with what a grand jury does, but if you think of a grand jury, it's a gatekeeper of sorts. It's a group of citizens that look at either the testimony of a police officer or another witness, and they're not deciding guilt or innocence like we would at a trial. A grand jury is looking at a set of facts and saying, is there enough here? Is there information here? Whereas if it happens the way the witness, who's usually a police officer, says, is there enough to bring a charge at all against this person? So it's a much lower standard than when you come to court for a trial, but it's a gatekeeping process we have here in the Commonwealth, where a group of average citizens look at the evidence against someone and make a determination whether or not there's enough information to bring a criminal charge in the first place against someone. So it's a very important function. We have rules about the timelines for which people's cases need to be presented to the grand jury. And my colleagues and I are involved in a series of hearings that we're holding right now on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. There's judges holding those on Saturdays just to extend that timeline for presenting those cases to the grand jury. In some cases, the extension's not being granted for various reasons, but the majority of them they are. so that we can present these to a grand jury at such time as we're able to convene that group again.
And for people who were, you know, if someone was arrested and waiting trial, are they stuck in jail until that trial can happen, or they're arraigned, or?
So our Commonwealth attorney, who is the head prosecutor, it's Tom Wine, and our county attorney is the head misdemeanor prosecutor, and that's Mike O'Connell, and their offices, along with the Office of the Louisville Metro Public Defender and Private Defense Bar, we have all been working together very cooperatively to try to identify individuals who maybe have a bad history of getting back to court, or who are charged with Class D or less crimes in the community, and for the immediate future, getting them out of our jails and on to maybe home incarceration, where they have a GPS monitor tracking their movement, or in other forms of supervision until such time as we can hear their cases. So as of a couple of weeks ago, we had reduced our prison population by 36% from what it would normally be. And we continue, I still see orders every day where the prosecutors and the defenders have made either an agreement regarding what somebody's custody status should be pending, or the judges are hearing also motions by defense lawyer. Of course, you always, you know, there's a reason the scales of justice are the symbol for what we do in this branch of government, because you're always engaged in a balancing. So the community doesn't want to hear, oh, we're just letting everyone out of the jails, because the community wants to feel safe, especially at a time when we're all feeling a little bit vulnerable because of this virus. But you've got to balance that with having a group of individuals charged with any range of things being in a confinement situation, where if you don't have extra space to be able to quarantine somebody who comes up positive with the virus, that could create a really hazardous situation. So you're balancing community safety, and you're balancing people who are charged with crimes in our community, their rights and due process rights, and trying to find, you know, a good decision to make. And again, that's one of the things we're tasked with doing. It's one of the things our justice system partners are tasked with doing. So I think everybody's sensitive about what's going on with those that are incarcerated, trying to do the best we can to get them out, but keep in people we think are a high likelihood to reoffend or cause harm in the community. And those are tough calls, but I feel like everyone involved has been very responsible and compassionate and realistic in coming together to make those decisions.
You know, obviously this situation is really unprecedented, but I'm curious, has there been any sort of emergency like this that you've encountered in your career, or maybe even heard about from before? I mean, is there any precedent for this sort of thing?
You know, I was teasing with my family when this whole situation came, because there have been so many, as I said, thoughtful meetings between system partners about how to handle any number of issues that have come up. And in the law, we rely on what's called jurisprudence. We look at how judges have decided cases in similar circumstances before based upon our laws, and we use that as kind of our guiding star for how we decide things. You're absolutely right, and it's a good question. I tease with my family, I never in my legal studies took Pandemic 101, and what you do when somebody doesn't comply with a health department order to quarantine or isolate themselves, or what you do as a legal community when you have this important constitutional right to be confronted by your accuser and to be in court in person, but then you're confronted with a situation where it's dangerous for people to be together in groups as we would normally convene in a courtroom. So it has been challenging. I can say I've been on the bench 18 years, and I was a lawyer 14 years before that. So I have a long legal career, and I've never seen a situation like this. It's unprecedented. Now, I can tell you we've had some look at regulations that were in place when we had a tuberculosis outbreak in the past. I think things that happened when the Spanish flu were around were so old that there's no real viable legal precedent from that. But there has been some guidance from the tuberculosis situation that we have looked at in making some of these decisions. And we, for the the best thing I can say is, as the chief circuit judge right now, this has really been a joint process. Our Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Minton, our Jefferson County Supreme Court Justice, Lisa Beth Hughes, have been very involved. They haven't just sat back and said, okay, trial judges, let's see how you handle this. They've been very involved in giving us guidance and leadership and looking through all of our laws and regulations, as have my colleagues. We've been meeting in emergency meetings twice a week, just trying to figure out how we're gonna address the things that the court system needs to get done. So all around, everybody's been stepping up and contributing, and trying to come up with the best way we can keep business going in a bad situation. And by bad situation, you know, everybody, we're all worried about the businesses in our community, the people that are out of work in our community, and of course, people in care homes, you know, everybody's grandparents, people that are vulnerable. So there's a lot of worry and stress to spread around. And I think the community needs to know that, you know, we still live in a place where the rule of law governs, and that, you know, judges and law enforcement and everybody that's involved in that process is doing the best we can to make sure that the community's served. But you're right, it's been unique and it's been challenging. I need to write a manual for people that come after me about what to do in a pandemic.
Well, hopefully that won't be a manual that anybody will use for a very long time.
Amen.
Do you know if are there any challenges? I'm just wondering, you know, Jefferson County versus the other 119 counties. Are the rural, smaller counties having different situations? Are you aware of that, or is it pretty much the same across the board?
Well, you know, the urban centers of our Commonwealth, so, you know, Jefferson County, to some extent Northern Kentucky and Fayette, the larger counties, we always say we're not special, but we are different. You know, an urban community, in terms of getting cases heard when dealing with the numbers that we see versus all of our sister and brother counties out in the state, there are some things that are the same for all of us, and then some things that are a little bit different. I think out in the county, they have had some of the same issues, just how to conduct hearings, judges trying to conduct hearings from home. But you think everything we do in a court of law has to be made part of a record, you know, has to be made part of a court record. So if you're using Skype, finding a way to publish that later in some format so that if something has to be reviewed at an appellate level. We've had a few cases here in Jefferson County, I'm happy to say not many, where citizens in our community haven't complied with orders from our local health department, who has the authority in this kind of pandemic to order them to isolate or quarantine. And we've had a few cases brought to us where folks weren't complying with those orders. And I know my colleagues, just because I've talked to a few of my colleagues out in the state, have had to deal with similar types of issues as well. All of us are dealing with the issues in terms of our grand juries meeting, and then starting to figure out a way that we can run some of our civil dockets. Eviction cases have been a huge hot button issue. You know, if you're normally in a position where you could be evicted from where you live under a quarantine or an order where most people are supposed to be staying at home, how do those issues handled? And, you know, the whole host of things. We're all pretty united. And like I said, we've had some pretty strong central leadership from our Supreme Court. And they're good about getting us in contact with each other too, to kind of talk through issues and best practices and problems we've had. But we're certainly all in this as a state. We get together as judges once a year at a statewide, we call it a college. It's basically a learning experience for all of us. And it's really nice because there are so many things that we all see that are the same throughout the state. And then there are ways in which our urban communities, of course, where we live here in Jefferson County being the largest, have unique concerns and issues.
Thank you. I've got a couple specific questions I want to go through, and I know we've kind of touched on some of these and may have even answered some of them, but I want to still go through them because I'm not enough of a legal expert to know if we really answered them or not.
Sure.
So I know one of these, you know, you touched on this a little bit, but, you know, if somebody has, I'm just going to read that. I'm not going to try to paraphrase it. What if a parenting time visitation order is not being followed during this emergency? can a parent, through their attorney, file a motion of some sort?
Yeah, I know that that's been an important question, and you can imagine, the difficulty of, we have a lot of blended families and split visitation in our Commonwealth, and I can imagine the stress on parents in trying to comply with the CDC guidelines and then having to have a child that's going back and forth between two households. Our court has said, and our governor, that those split visitation orders should be complied with, notwithstanding anything unusual. And if there is a case where they're not, our family court judges are working hard during this pandemic, and you can reach out and contact the court, and they can set an emergency hearing to hear those kind of cases. If you're a parent and you have, a co-parenting agreement, and for whatever reason the other parent is not honoring that, and they should be, you can get in front of a judge for an emergency hearing. The courts are operating. And again, how that looks, it may be by Zoom or Skype, it may not be in the courtroom. If you come into the courtroom, there's going to be a limit to how many people, and you're going to need to practice social distancing. But the family courts are hearing those types of cases, and you can reach out through the clerk's office or through their staff to make a motion to get heard on that.
Thank you. There's a question in the comments here, so I'm going to read that. We see a huge disparity within LGBTQ youth in the justice system due to rejection from family, being bullied in school, increased rate of incarceration, especially for transgender people of color, and more. What outlets do you see or use in the community that can help elevate the LGBTQ community being tied up in the judicial system? As someone who rules on the law, are there places in the law or legislation that you see that caused that disparity among LGBTQ people?
That's obviously a huge, huge question, probably larger than the time we have here today. But a couple points I would make on that. I've heard and seen some things about LGBTQ populations and how just this whole situation affects them differently. And I think the point of view of the question was disparate treatment here in the legal system. And there's so many things that we need to do as a system. Here in the United States of America, we are all equal. We are all to be treated equal everywhere we go, but in particular in the eyes of the law. And I think judges continue to educate themselves. One of the nice things about the United States and our judges is that we're elected. So we are out there in the community, meeting with all of the members of our community and interfacing and being able to hear things like your question or ask, where you feel like maybe you aren't treated as fairly if you come into the legal system, or that there's a disproportionate confinement of members of trans community. I think education of judges and education of court system partners is certainly an important component of that. We have had racial disparate treatment in the court system that I've been on. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court years ago established a racial fairness task force that's headed by Court of Appeals Judge Denise Clayton, that goes through kind of looking at every step in the process, from when someone is first brought in with a pretrial report where a judge is making a bond decision on up and through. And I think similar types of considerations need to be made for individuals who have different concerns. Something that comes to mind is things like privileges that we have under our rules of evidence for individuals not to testify against a spouse. With the advent of the Oberfeld case and same-sex marriage, that goes a long way towards creating protections for LGBT families, being able to have those laws enforced, things like in our rules of evidence. But we can do better. Anywhere statistics show us that there's a difference, we need to look hard at all elements of the process. With respect to LGBTQ communities and this virus, I think we have to be on the lookout for, is there any further isolation? I know just from having neighbors, friends, LGBT people that I'm very close with, family members. There can be a lot of community and community gatherings. And when that's interrupted, then you need to check with people to make sure, that they're doing okay. And that affects all of us, but it could be particularly acute for folks who are in an LGBT community that have their normal outlets for gathering and being able to be heard, being able to vent. And if those are stymied, what that can cause. The whole myriad of reasons that anyone would feel treated differently in the justice system can go down to, comments of an individual judge, law enforcement officer, corrections person, but really people being educated, people being responsible about educating themselves, people making themselves aware of issues, making sure you take time to ask and open your eyes are all things that I think we need to be doing as a justice system.
Thank you. Yeah, you're absolutely right about isolation. I mean, to be LGBTQ is to have experienced isolation at some point in your life in some capacity. And that's one of the reasons we're doing these programs is because, we'd be doing 3 or 4 things a month, bringing people together, and
Right.
We're not able to do that. So how do we connect with people?
Right.
And speaking of that, that just made me think of this is a very specific question, but one of the things that for people who are transgender, they're almost always going to go through the legal process of changing their name at some point. Is something like that on hold completely while this is all going on, or can somebody still have a legal name change?
That's handled through our district court. It's not handled through circuit court, but when you file a petition to change your name, you generally have a hearing. You'll file a form. The clerk's office is still open. So I would say you would be able to file the petition to change your name. You would normally appear on a district court motion docket on that request to change your name, and then you'd be in front of the judge and the judge would grant your petition. I would have to check. I don't want to give you bad information about whether there's any virtual. I think right now over in district court, they aren't holding civil hearings in any other way, but I also know from recent meetings that just like us, we were all scrambling a bit. The first priority was dealing with people that are obviously in custody and have their liberty interests taken away. So other important things that are civil in nature, meaning somebody wanting to change their name or get married or other things, have been on hold. And I know that part is true, that they've been on hold. So if probably for the last 3 weeks somebody wanted to come down to court and get their name changed, they wouldn't have been able to. I know my district court colleagues are working to try to open up some level of hearing of civil cases. So I would think perhaps in the coming weeks, there may be a process for that to go ahead, and you could file the motion. My concern is when and where it would be heard and how. And I don't know if they're going to open that up over in district before we open up June 1. It may be that they start holding some of those civil dockets or motion hours in some kind of virtual way. But hopefully the longest it would be is until the currently scheduled reopening for that kind of name change.
And you mentioned foreclosures and evictions. I don't know if you can hear my dogs, but I guess somebody's at the door.
You can tell them they're out of order. They are
yes.
Out of order. No,
there's a lot more deliveries happening on the street this week. So this month. In terms of evictions and foreclosures, there's, if I understand correctly, there's an order in place that evictions should not happen. What does that really look like? What does that mean for somebody, if there was an eviction that had already started or a foreclosure that had already started? And then what will that mean when things go back to normal?
I'm glad you asked me that specific question because I think that there's some misinformation out there. So right now, all evictions are suspended. Eviction is a legal process where a landlord can come down and say, because a tenant, let's say, is not paying rent or they're causing some kind of trouble or somehow in direct violation of their lease agreement, the landlord can pursue eviction proceedings. It's a very formal legal proceeding where the person is entitled to have notice of the eviction. They're entitled to come down in front of a judge and be heard on their side, but they're not, an eviction process isn't deciding who owes who rent. An eviction process is not deciding, if you're a landlord, whether someone has damaged your property. An eviction process is surely the legal point of who has right to be in possession or on that leased premises. So for right now, during this COVID-19 virus situation, evictions have stopped in that landlords can't force tenants to leave their property. If an eviction order is entered, we call it an order enforceable detainer. If that is entered, you have 7 days in order to leave the property. On the 8th day, somebody from the sheriff's department could come and set your things out. So none of that process is going on because obviously it's not the time as a community. We want to be putting people out on the street when we're asking people to be healthy at home. But the misinformation, I think, it doesn't mean that you get to live or stay wherever you are rent-free. And I've heard a lot of people say that they believe because no one can be evicted that at that point they get to stay where they are in place and that they won't have to pay rent. So it's important that people understand you can stay where you are, but it doesn't mean your lease doesn't have any effect, or that if your rent is $800 a month or $1,200 a month, that you still owe that rent, and that if there are late fees that can accrue under your lease contract. So you can still owe rent at the end of the period. The landlord just doesn't have the right now to have you come and ask to leave the premises or forced to leave. They could even say, hey, John, you're not paying rent, or Jane, please move out. But they can't legally avail themselves of that eviction process. But I just don't want people to get in more financial trouble than a lot of people, all of us, are going to be in because of this situation, by thinking that the lack of eviction means nobody owes rent for the property they're on. It means right now, it's not the time to throw someone out legally, but the landlord will still have the ability to come after somebody for rent. And I would just want people to know that.
Along those lines, if people have court fees or fines or something like that, is that similarly on hold? I know when you get a parking ticket, yeah.
They're going to get extra time to pay those fines and costs because we don't want people coming down here to the courthouse to pay those. So there will be extra time to pay fines and costs. If you had, we call it a show cause date. It's a date by which your fines or costs on a criminal case or a civil case need to be paid. There'll be an extension for those deadlines into the time that we reopen. We don't want people coming down here to have to, pay a fine.
Right. And everybody's in the same boat. So there's going to be this however many days we'll just kind of have to add to everything.
I will add that our Supreme Court did not do a blanket extension of all civil dates, but there'll be a lot of judicial discretion. Judges will be looking at individual situations and seeing whether something happened that was supposed to or didn't, and whether the virus is a reason it didn't happen. There's just going to be a lot of decisions made and discretion used by judges about that.
But if you can't show that the virus caused you to, it's not necessarily a blanket excuse for everything, right?
Right. It may not be a blanket excuse for everything, which
right.
is, the Supreme Court didn't say we're just going to extend everything in a civil context. But again, the judges will be using quite a bit of discretion when we get people back in front of us and we get the story about what happened.
I've got another question here in the comments. How do you see the most recent Kentucky Senate Bill number 2, which requires the voter ID, government issued ID? How's that going to impact voters who are not going to be able to get one before the primary or even the general election? Do you think that's going to be, a court battle? And I would add to that just the larger sense of, what are we going to be doing with these elections in June and November?
So here's an interesting point. We all know from our high school civics that we have 3 branches of government. So we have our legislative branch, and that's the most highly visible, and I'm going to call it the sexiest branch because everybody pays attention to it. It's where we fight about what our laws ought to be. then the executive, signs those in. They've got the bully pulpit also to talk in the community and get public opinion. And then you have your judicial branch. And one of the reasons I was interested in being a judge is I always say we're the ones, in the trenches with the parties saying, here's how the law applies to you and your situation. So when you're talking about important things like your viewer wrote in about a House bill that requires individuals to have ID and a concern about whether that would disenfranchise someone, those are all valid concerns. And because ultimately those issues may work their way to a judge, we try to refrain from taking sides on whether something is good or bad, either when it's enacted or even in the battle about whether it ought to be enacted, because ultimately my job as a trial court judge is to look at what law is there and then look at the factual situation that's presented to me. We also go as judges and sit with the Board of Elections on election day. When people come in and they contest if they've been denied the right to vote, we sit in with the Board of Elections and have some judgment to make on those situations. So it's not that I'm, being coy about my position about any particular legislation, but I would want to be in a position to be able to use my legal skills to decide how that ought to apply in real life without anyone thinking I was commenting saying, oh, this is a really good thing or this is a really bad thing that we just enacted this legislation, because my opinion of that legislation has nothing to do with my ability as a judge being able to look at whether any given facts before me comply with that law or don't. So I don't, again, I'm not being coy about not answering the question. I just am defining what my role is and ultimately looking at those things. So I try not to get out front and say what I think of them personally, because I have to do my job as a judge every day. And when somebody brings an issue before me and says, hey, maybe this person should or shouldn't have been given the right to vote, I want to be able to look at that without them also saying, but you said this on the Foundation Fairness podcast or web, or I don't know what this is, a web program.
Yeah, we call it community conversation. I don't know. Yeah, episode, broadcast.
Conversation, exactly.
No, that makes perfect sense. Do you have any general thoughts about what we're looking at with a delayed election, or if are people going to be able to vote by mail, or is there anything you could share on that? Or
I am sure all of that, through our Secretary of State and through our legislatures is going to be looked at. And to some extent, it may even become a hard fought issue as we head into November.
Mm-hmm.
As we head into November, it's an important election. I know for everybody, elections are important. It's not an election year for judges, but there are times and places where we're on the ballot as well. Obviously, the community feels strongly about everyone having their voice heard, and then opinions can diverge about the best way to do that. And again, I am not in the trenches of making those types of decisions, where as judges, I'll probably come in, will be after the fact, or people higher up than me after the fact. If some legislation is enacted that says, here's how votes should occur, one of my colleagues somewhere in the system could be asked to take a look at that. So we'll certainly do it if that comes to pass. It's going to be interesting when you have, again, as you said, in the legal community and for our secretaries of state and our voting process, we've never had a situation where, coming up on an election, it's not advisable for people to be together in groups. And whether that can be safely done by November or whether we're going to need to rework it and have mail-in ballots, we'll have to see where we're headed with that.
Yeah, I think this will be a really interesting situation that people will be studying for years, because it's putting stress on all sort of our basic assumptions. I mean, freedom of worship and freedom of assembly, and then the right to a speedy trial and elections. I mean, everything is kind of like, well, wait a minute, this is the one case in a million where we have to do something different.
You're right. Back to that balancing. We're Americans, and one of the huge and beautiful things about America is all of those rights that you just talked about. We have a freedom of speech. We have a freedom of movement. We aren't, you know, in my lifetime told we can't travel places. We can't assemble together in groups for things we believe in, for your faith, for any community organization you believe in. And you're right. And then there's this tension where is your gathering affecting the health and safety of others? And those are tough issues. They're not easy for anybody to grapple with. And everybody has strong opinions about it. So as we move forward with all of these different things, it's going to be interesting to see. And I hope people will treat each other respectfully in the debate, treat each other compassionately. You know, I always say one of the things that I think is important to being a good judge is to be non-judgmental, meaning everybody comes to the table with a whole different walk there, a whole different path that got them there. And all of us sometimes need to stop and look at the battle other people have had to fight. And I think the more we can try to treat each other with respect as we work through how to handle all of this, and try to be open-minded to listening to other people's points of view, the better off we're going to be. But it's going to be interesting. You're right.
And one more specific question, then I got a couple just kind of closing general ones I want to ask you. But if somebody needs an emergency protective order, what do they do in this situation?
So there's a couple of things. We have well, number one, if somebody's hurting you in your home, you can call 911. You know, the police are going to respond. You are not alone. The system is still here. No one during this period of quarantine and isolation or healthy at home or stay at home should be feeling like they have no options, because there are still options out there. So if you're being threatened or hurt at home, call 911. Apart from that, and any officer who comes can help you work through the process of filing for an emergency protective order, which is an immediate ex parte order. And I say ex parte meaning the judge is just presented with your claim for help and decides whether or not you've stated a valid basis and would give you an order of protection. And then that comes back for a more formal hearing with everybody having a right to be heard. And then what's called a domestic violence order is put in place. That whole process, applying for a domestic violence order and emergency protective order, are still up and running and in place. Again, you may have to be a little patient about the way in which it looks. It might not look the same. But if the police come, they can certainly direct you how to file for an EPO, an emergency protective order. You can also come down due to the work of a lot of people, a lot of our family court judges, the National Council of Jewish Women in our community, the clerk's office. There is a 24-hour domestic violence intake center at 6th and Jefferson in the Hall of Justice. That intake center is open. You can come down and file a petition to get an emergency order of protection if you need it. They also have information in that intake center about community resources and options for you if you're fearful at home. Again, everybody in the justice system wants to be clear that we're getting that word out, that especially in a time, you know, we can all have arguments at home under the best of circumstances. Domestic violence situations are different. The dynamics of them are different, but the stressors that we're all under, you know, being isolated at home, not having the ability just to leave, not having the ability maybe that you would have to go and just, you know, stay with a friend for a couple of days while things cool off. All of those options are probably limited right now. So it's really important that the community know that the police will still respond to domestic violence calls, that the family courts are still hearing emergency hearings on domestic violence cases, and that you're not alone and that you're not without community resources, even under this special or difficult time, that those are all still in place in our court system.
Is there anything else you want to share, or any particular phone numbers or websites or anything people should know about?
The Court of Justice has a website that you can go on to for the state about what's going on. I would just tell people to be patient with us, that we are here working, that all of the judges are working hard and all the justice system partners are working hard. We are thinking about just the members of our community and everybody and what they're going through and the challenges everybody's facing because of this. It's tough on everybody. I read somewhere that people aren't sleeping as well and that people are having kind of crazy dreams. And I really think there's a lot of truth to that, that all of our day-to-day routines are changed. And then you add to that just kind of the low level stress of, you know, either yourself becoming sick, someone you care about becoming sick, a family member becoming sick. I know, you know, going through a grocery store should not be an anxiety producing event. And it is now. You know, when you turn down an aisle and there's 6 people there and you think, oh, I can't go down that aisle, but I really need drain cleaner because my drain is draining slowly. Just the stress. So to try to find times to take long walks, you know, in places where you're not with other people, and to take care of yourself and be easy on yourself, and try to talk to loved ones and friends in the format that you can. And, you know, not to sound trite, but we are more than ever aware of how we're all, you know, a community and a global community, that we're, you know, none of us are exempt from this, no matter what we believe or who we love. So just to keep in mind that we're all in this, and hopefully that there's going to be a side where we come out, and hopefully we will have learned some good things from this as well.
Well, that was going to be, so my last question was going to be kind of, what are you doing personally to, you know, to keep your spirits up, and or, you know, anything you've kind of seen that has made you feel good, you know, because we talk about all these bad things. So I always like to end kind of on a happy note. You spoke to a lot of that. Is there anything else you want to share that's kind of like, you know, something particularly good that you've seen through all this?
Well, you know, it's nice to see when you see examples of people out. I know at my church at St. Agnes, there's people out and back distributing Dare to Care food banks food. I read an article in the paper this morning about Dare to Care getting out there and making sure where people are food insecure, they're getting food, and neighbors helping neighbors. It's nice when you drive by and see things lit up green, you know, people are thinking of the victims. And it's hard to be Pollyanna in a situation that feels so stressful. But I do think if everybody kind of takes an assessment and looks at what silver lining or what good they can learn from all of this, and even if it's the point I just made about us all really being interconnected. You know, we get in our silos, we get in our communities of friends and people that we spend a lot of time with, and this really makes us realize that you know, that we're all not even just in our state, in our country, and then even in our world, that we all need each other, you know, that we all perform roles, how important our hairdressers have become. We never thought about that, how important our grocery workers have become, how obviously important our healthcare workers are. So just kind of waking up and realizing what matters for you. And for me, a big thing is just being able to get out and walk or run or, you know, exercise a little bit as well. But I hope that there's some that comes of this. Hard to see right now, I'm sure.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I think it's been very helpful, and we've got some good information out there. There's so much uncertainty in the air right now. So just having a chance to kind of talk about some of this is very useful. Thursday, we'll be back to talk about mutual aid and community response. And then next Tuesday, we're going to talk about how this issue is affecting immigrants and refugees, particularly. Friday at 8, we've got the UAW Local 862 Digital Pride Drag Show, and we're always trying to add more and more things. If you have ideas, contact us. If you want to find out ways to help, you can go to our website, louisvillepride.com/COVID-19, COVID-19. We've got information on how to get resources, if you're needing to find a food bank or something like that, as well as how to volunteer. And if there's anything you want to add there, please contact us. So thank you very much, Judge Bisig, and thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time. And I'm going to find if I can stop the recording. Somewhere in here.
Are you at home?
Yes.